Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joshua Ladon. I'm the West Coast Director of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. I'm joined today by three wonderful panelists for a conversation we're calling The Revelation Will Be Digitized, Jewish Education After COVID-19. Our panelists today are Lisa Colton, who's the founder and president of Darim Online, really one of the first voices out there to think about Jewish life and Jewish education in the internet age. Darim, as in from to dwell, has really been thinking about infusing Jewish life online for almost 20 years now. As well, she's one of the organizers of the Great Big Jewish Food Fest, which is going on right now. And if you haven't checked it out yet, you should. My second panelist is Daniel Septimus, who has also been involved in Jewish education online for quite a while, currently as the CEO of Sefaria, former founder and CEO, editor of myjewishlearning.com. And finally, Miriam Heller-Stern, Dr. Miriam Heller-Stern, the national director and assistant professor at the School of Education at Hebrew Union College, and also recent creator of Beit HaYotzer, the Creativity Brain Trust at HUC. So it's really wonderful to have all of you together here for this really interesting and exciting conversation. I'll just send a couple of announcements to our viewers at home. First of all, we are going to have a Q&A towards the end. So if you have questions and answer, please put them into the Q&A chat section. Sorry, excuse me, the Q&A and not the chat section down at the bottom. Any mistakes I make today are just part of a masterclass on how to do Jewish education better online. And I'm just giving you an opportunity to feel like everyone's feeling their way through it. Also, we have a survey at the end of the webinar, so please take that survey. This webinar will be recorded and will be available later. I also want to give a shout out to our friends watching as it's being streamed on Facebook. For those of you who have not been a part of a Shalom Hartman Institute learning program before, the Shalom Hartman Institute is a leading center of Jewish thought and education in Israel and North America, and our mission is to strengthen Jewish people, identity, and pluralism, and to enhance the Jewish and democratic character of Israel, and to ensure that Judaism is a compelling force for good in the world. Thank you to my panelists for joining. This is a really, really weird time to be in Jewish education. We have seen over the last 10 weeks a rapid digitization of Jewish life. And that rapid digitization really creates a lot of interesting opportunities and a lot of challenges for Jewish educators and really the industry of Jewish education. And when we talk about the industry of Jewish education, it's worth noting it's really a bunch of different industries, right? There is the traditional schooling model, whether in day schools or supplementary schools. There's preschools, there's adult education, there's trips to Israel, there's Moshe House. It's really a broad spectrum of sites and practices. And to rapidly digitize means that a lot of people are trying to figure things out on the fly. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to speak with three people who are really at the core of different elements of Jewish education and different parts of Jewish education, some with more experience in the online world, some really at the center of what it means to train Jewish educators to have their finger on the pulse of what is necessary for Jewish life. And in my mind, it really brings up three broad questions, right? The first one is, now that it's digitized, it transforms Jewish education, not just technically, but all of a sudden I have to think about how I'm teaching, how I'm enacting Jewish education, and that looks really differently in different settings. It brings up a really big question of what I teach then. There are certain things that translate really nicely into the digital world. There are other things that it's not clear how to do it, but also why would I do it and what am I trying to achieve? And therefore, there's also stuff in digital Jewish education. The digital transformation actually enhances and opens doors to new content areas. And then the final thing is that digitization is actually creating new modes of Jewish life, and Jewish education is oftentimes a facilitator of how to become a Jewish citizen to engage in Jewish life. So what does it mean to become a Jewish digital citizen, we might say, and live life Jewishly online? There are, of course, also questions about economics and politics of Jewish education. Should things be free? And I want to get there eventually, but I really want to start with this question of, well, if we're going to start teaching online, we're going to start doing Jewish education online. What are some of the big questions that we should be asking about the programs we run? For those of us who are either Jewish educators, for those of us who are parents of Jewish students, what are the questions we should be thinking about as we move into thinking about teaching digitally? And I want to start with you, Miriam, because because I want to put you on the spot, and because your role in both training educators and supporting a field of Jewish education, you have a broad vision. So what are you seeing, and also what do people need to be asking?
So you asked what are the big questions for us right now, prompted by this rapid digitization or the need to go online. In certain ways, we just need to drill down on the questions we already should have been asking. Thinking not just about what are we teaching and how we teach it, but who are we teaching to and how are we relating to those people? So if I'm a teacher of Torah, I should not just identify myself as someone who teaches Torah. I should identify myself as someone who teaches people. I need to relate to those people. I need to figure out how to use these digital tools to be in deep and meaningful relationship with those learners. That means I need to get to know them. I need to know what their needs are. I need to know what their interests are. I need to know what motivates them to show up. I need to know how I'm going to engage them in thinking more deeply and about new content after we begin our conversation and our learning together. I think the other question that is coming up in this moment is with the expanded access to knowledge. We have, some of the real pioneers of the field on this call with us today that I'm excited to hear from too. I haven't seen these folks in a while. What will our learners do with this knowledge? There's so much access, but how will they go online and discern and determine what is trustworthy? How do they make sense of sources? How do they even search? I love looking at my kids pick up their phones and say, Siri, what's the Talmud? They need to know then what to do with those answers that come up when their searches produce lots and lots of options, many of which are going to be competing for their attention. But again, for all sorts of agendas that aren't really necessarily about who they are, what they're seeking, and what they might do with the information. And I'll add just a third question about the digitization, which is, I think we should be thinking about what we want learners to do with the knowledge. What does it mean to access Jewish wisdom? And then how will we begin to think about the kind of collective and the kind of world we want to build through the transformation that we're going through in this pandemic, and what we want to see on the other side? And how can all of this Jewish wisdom that we could access aid us in that collective project of building a better world?
Thanks. Lisa, Daniel, any responses or thoughts? Lisa.
Sure. I agree with everything that Miriam just said. I'll also add that I think this moment in time is forcing us to acknowledge and I hope start to wrestle with and let go of some of the assumptions that have been underlying the way that we conceive of and do Jewish education. And I mean that in every aspect of it, which many of which I think are holdovers from previous generations and previous iterations of our economy and our attention and our family systems and the way that generations relate to Judaism, a Jewish identity, Jewish community, Jewish learning. And I think that what we're seeing right now is not just that we have this new technology thing, but actually that there's a lot of other changes in society and in generations that really should be forcing us to ask a lot of those questions, as Miriam said, that we should have been already asking prior to this situation, but that turns the screws a little bit. I find it useful to look at other products and fields in our society that we can relate to as individuals and kind of understand what does that shift look like in other disciplines? And then, okay, now that I kind of can see through those lenses, how do I now look at Jewish education through that changed lens as well? And one that I think is appropriate here is looking at how we as a society do knowledge management. Right, so for hundreds and hundreds of years, we had the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was the gold standard of knowledge management. It was really expensive. It got out of date really quickly. Only certain people could afford it. The rest of us went to the library and pulled the dusty volumes off the shelves to do our learning and reports in school. And now we have Wikipedia. And those are two entirely different ways of doing essentially the same function. So I think it requires like this big step back to get very clear on what is the function that we want Jewish education to play. And then what assumptions about that function do we really need to let go of in order to see how we can optimally do it at this time and then moving forward.
Great. Daniel, anything to add?
Yeah, I guess I'll zoom out by, questioning the premise to some extent. If the Jewish community had, had properly digitized, what that would have looked like was like in 1998, 1999, 2000, we got online. It wouldn't have been, there's an emergency, you can't go outside, you have to be online, right? So I want to, temper our sense that there's a revolution happening. If there was a different kind of natural disaster and we were forced to be in our basements, no one would be saying, how can we use tunneling technology to help, build a more robust future Judaism? We'd be saying, like, eventually we're going to get out of the basement and, like, some things might change, but most things won't. So it just, in terms of, perspective, I don't think there hasn't been a rapid digitization of Jewish life. There's been a rapid digitization of institutional Jewish life, particularly institutions that weren't online before, because they were forced to, for the most part. So again, like, we're just in terms of context, it could very well be that, like, we want to get out of this as quickly as possible and go back to as much in-person stuff as possible, right? Like, the question, that I think we want to be asking right now is, the whole Jewish community has been forced into an experiment in trying to teach online for the last 8 to 10 weeks. What did we learn? What did we learn? I have no idea, by the way. I have no idea, but, like, that's the only thing that right now, I think, like, that's the question we should ask. We shouldn't be planning now. We have no idea, like, what the future is gonna look like, actually, right? We need to be, we asking questions about what's happening, what's working, why, which institutions will this kill? That's all very relevant. That being said, one caveat, I would say that I believe that globally, culturally, this pandemic is like the final, the final page of the analog era, right? So to the extent that anyone was still living only analog and not digital, and there were many Jewish educators who said, I don't do online, I don't do the right, like, that is not a thing anymore, right? So, I think we have taken one big final step into the, the whole world has taken one big final step into the digital age. But the fact that the Jewish community, is on the last page being forced to do it, is that's actually what's happening, I think. And now, okay, so now we could start to, continue to analyze what's happening now and start to plan for the future.
Thanks. I think both of what I heard Daniel and Lisa, both of you say, which I think is really helpful, is there's a institutional question that's emerging, and there's like Jewish life as it's actually played out and lived and practiced. And I'll just point out, I'll point to David Bashevkin's article recently about Jewish Twitter as being a site for pluralist Jewish learning in ways that he never would have imagined, which I think is a great analog to this discussion. I wonder if we could take a tight example of something I know educators are dealing with right now and actually pull it apart with the different expertises in the room, which is to say, Daniel is saying, well, what have we learned? So I want to think together a little bit about what have we learned. Could we imagine, even through our small little lenses, for me watching my 7-year-old try to navigate online day school, and my wife, who teaches at a Jewish day school, navigate what she needs to navigate with faculty. So we all have our different lenses. What have we learned in service of thinking about a little bit about what Lisa said, which is how could we rethink the structures, and what Miriam said, which is what are the things we want students to learn or do, and who are they as people, what do they need? Let's take for those people who are planning a very traditional program right now, Jewish day school or supplementary program, which translates a little easier than perhaps maybe summer camp or an Israel program to the online space. What are the questions they should be asking about as they think about next year? Not just the political questions, I mean the educational questions. What are the ways they could think about it differently? What are the things we've seen even in the last 8 to 10 weeks that we might surface? And I'll dealer's choice, which is a horrible practice for Zoom, or maybe dealer's choice is the right thing. I'm going to popcorn style and let whoever wants to jump in first, which is a horrible thing for Zoom, but I'm putting on to everyone can then see why it's a bad idea and really I should be choreographing that. But does anyone want to jump in first and say, this is what I've seen and I wonder where this leads us?
Okay, I'll go. I'm not the most educator expert in the room here, so I'll just offer one thing and then really curious what others have to say too. Here's the bifurcation that I'm seeing. There are people who are taking their traditional program, curriculum, approach, modality, structure of time, whatever you want to say, and pivoting it to be online. And they're struggling. They're swimming upstream against a really stiff current. And then there are those who are saying, okay, what am I trying to accomplish here? And what's the best way to do that in the current environment? And instead of pivoting what existed in a different norm, they're doing it differently. It's really like if you were a bird, the way that you would navigate space is very different than if you were a fish versus if you're an air-breathing biped, right? It's just different environments. So don't take your 2 legs and try and go exist in the trees. It's not going to work out well. You need wings. So the advice that I would give is to really strip down the clear purpose and goals of what you want to be accomplishing, and then re-sculpt that lump of clay for the environment that you're going to be in. I've been super impressed with my kids' schools, how they've week to week been iterating. And this goes back, I think, to a lot of kind of, design thinking, innovation, permanent beta kind of culture, which is try something, even if it's acknowledging it's not going to be perfect, with a curious mind, which is a great thing to model, by the way, in education, and really be honest with yourself and learn and then continue to tweak it. And the way that my kids' schools have been doing more asynchronous things that might be team projects or interviewing people, really making very rich use of that asynchronous time, but getting the kids up and out and talking to people and not just sitting in front of a screen. I think that's a great attitude to take as you approach it.
Thanks. Asynchronous, by the way, for those playing at home, when learning happens not all at the same time in one classroom, but multiple different learning objectives happening and learning practices happening at different times, and then students come back together at some other time. Miriam, hey, what would you add?
So now it's my turn to say yes and to everything Lisa started us off with. Starting with goals and aspirations is key, and then choosing structures and delivery tools that make sense for those goals. If it's an institution where one of the primary goals is to create community and a sense of belonging around shared ideas, values, and practices, and here I'm really thinking about the supplemental school system, then spending time to build relationship and build community in a digital space or in a new normal will be important. Kids are socialized to relate to one another in environments that they're accustomed to. And so if the environment is going to change, whether it's a digital environment or whether they're living in a geographic location where they can meet outside, distanced in small groups, when we're seeing the emergence of different possibilities of what fall might look like, I would encourage educators to really think about all of those possibilities and to really take the time, not just to build into the structure, the hours, the expectations of what was, but to imagine, gee, how could we build community in a different way now? How can we use our teens as madrichim who may be less over-programmed now in this new environment and use them as small group conveners? Get them involved in becoming para-educators and put them on a path to really soaking up a love of lifelong learning themselves. Are there ways that we have to be really mindful about building community and a learning community online? And that means we have to be really mindful about how we welcome people into a Zoom room. How do you create a kind of like sacred holy space in a Zoom room? Our executive master's students who just graduated HUC came up with this mezuzah, which was a really cute sort of ritual object to sort of like put a mezuzah around this space and think about entering it and exiting it in a holy way. So I think there are a lot of ways that we can be creative about how we gather, but also how we ritualize how we gather, and create new structures that might not have been possible before and might not even be what we do in the long term, but they might be transformative for now, and that's going to be important.
Sorry, my mute button got stuck, which is never a good Zoom experience. I think I want to push both of you, and Daniel, feel free to jump in here, but I want to express like something I'm nervous about that I'm seeing, and hear and Miriam, you started to talk about this around, we need to meet people where they are as people. And my concern is online education has the capacity to really advance certain learning objectives in the language of like learning ideas or texts or facts, right? Content acquisition. And I'm just wondering, can it be done that it also supports human development, the communal experience of being with other people? So I'm wondering, is that how do schools think about those issues as they're, in a traditional learning setting, as they're thinking about, recreating or creating a new wheel? I don't know what the right metaphor is.
This is you're hitting on a progressive educational principle that's close to my heart, but I want to make room if Daniel wanted to jump in first. But I don't know, should I go ahead?
I was going to make a point about progressive education, so I'll tee that up and then you can pick up from there. Which is that, the stuff we're most excited about at Sefaria and the stuff that I'm involved with at my kids' school, where I'm on the board of the Laurier Academy of Brooklyn, right, is really about creating experiences for students that are student-led experiences and driven by the students' curiosity, and creating a good sense of independence and executive functioning for the students, right? So like I'm always amazed at my kids' school when they're, talking about the 5th graders, executive, how they're doing with their executive functioning. training, but ultimately, the way this translates into an online environment, and I'm seeing this with my kids, is they're already used to working, to not having the teachers lead their teaching, but they have agency over their own learning already. And so the fact that the teacher's not in the classroom, it's not as big as of a hindrance. The teacher is more of a facilitator of small group conversations, something where you come, back and forth, but a lot less frontal education and a lot more letting students explore and end up in different directions.
Thank you. So I'll build on that. Using spending time preparing learners to use, let's say, a resource like Sefaria or others like it to do online research will enable them to then go off in small groups and do research projects. Add in the interviewing component that Lisa recommended, where students are actually reaching out to people in the community. I'm just looking at the various things my 5th grader has done in his Jewish day school at home. I've had a very close view of my kids' schooling over the last 10 weeks. And I've been amazed at their independence. My older students, that is. We can bracket little kids in early childhood and how we support them in this digital environment, because I think it's actually, in many ways, it's been quite limited for the younger set. But for a 5th grader in this moment, to have the opportunity to work in a small group setting on a FaceTime or a Zoom with 3 or 4 peers and work through a series of problems, come up with a creative project, do their research, come back together, they feel a sense of ownership, and they're producing little movies, and they're writing stories, and they're writing papers and newspaper articles, and they're developing a voice. They're developing a leadership voice. They're developing executive functioning skills. They will be able to do much more advanced things, I think, than if they had been just sitting in a classroom. I'd like to think they actually, with this particular teacher, they definitely would have been doing this in the classroom too. But this nudge can give teachers a little bit of an impetus to try to use some of these different modalities as well. And my son is in high school, and his high school, Shalhevet, is thinking about what it might look like to do some staggered project-based learning and then in-class learning. And it's a really interesting idea that they are playing with as well. I hope it's okay that I just revealed that. I'm very impressed with how they're thinking about it. I'll give them a shot.
I just want to build on that for a moment and say, what you just said, Miriam, is not only about Jewish education and about day schools. There's a lot embedded in what you just said that I think about in Jewish community writ large. Meaning, and this is where kind of the role of institutions comes back, and I just want to name it, that we design for what we measure. So if you're measuring the number of members or the number of tushes and seats or the number of people who show up for a service or a program or whatever, you're designing for that rather than for experiences or relationships or a sense of belonging or a strength and pride of identity or whatever else you're talking about. And I think that because of our kind of institution-driven community over the past generations, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just a little countercultural to the moment that we're in now, that we often over-professionalize a lot in Jewish life and expect people to show up, put their tush in a seat, and just absorb. And so I think what's being really forced on us now is designing in a different way to empower the learner, to empower the community member. And I'm seeing that happen all over the place in ways that actually I think are incredibly like beautiful and warm, like Kavanaugh's Megillah reading right when this was starting to break out in Seattle. It was very early on in the process. And we had way more people come to the Zoom Megillah reading than would have showed up and listened to that whole thing in person. And there was an entire conversation happening in the chat, very much on topic, adding a whole layer of richness that had we been in the room together, everybody would have had to be quiet while somebody up front was chanting, and that was that. So if you see the potential of the medium to not just be a decent substitute for the in-person, but actually to help you achieve some bigger, more complex goals that are sometimes hard to achieve in the room. It's not necessarily that it's better or worse, it's different, but we can take advantage of the opportunities that are new to actually build something greater perhaps than what might have been before.
Well, Lisa, Daniel, it looks like you were going to say something, and I wanted to push it to you because I think you've been part of two institutions that have really not focused on getting people's tushes and seats, but getting Torah in hands. Like, you've been really at central of democratizing Torah and just thinking about what it means to both be that comfortable with like letting people go, and what you've seen with that, and how you want those the tools to be used well, and what you've seen as the tool has grown and iterated.
Yeah. So I'm lucky. I was the right person to do a lot of this stuff because I got a lot of bad rabbi experiences in the first 16 years of my life. So I knew that the rabbis were not going to save Judaism. But in truth, I think a lot about my teacher, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg's thinking about the third era, right? And the first era is the biblical one in which God is the major player in the covenant, and in the second era, it's the rabbinic era in which humans take a larger role, but still the leaders are the rabbis. And Yitz already, in the 60s and 70s was alluding to a future of, every man his own rabbi, he wrote in the 70s, right? This idea that of, further democratization of the covenant, actually, and of what leadership looks like and what authority looks like ultimately, right? So I have no qualms about, destroying those institutions because of my education. Luckily, I was traumatized enough to not have qualms about destroying the institution of the rabbinate or the synagogue, for that matter. So I think that's why it's been easy to do, because it's not actually I think it would be, Judaism and the world will be better if Judaism is in the hands of the people. And so that's what we've been working on.
Miriam.
So I want to jump in. And I want to encourage us to take a both and approach on institutions. I think first of all, it's very promising that there are so many Jews who are taking hold of the Torah in their own hands and making it their own, and that we have access to knowledge and access to building community in new ways so that people can do that. And there are still a lot of Jews out there who are turning to fantastic rabbis and congregations that are offering a wellspring where they can come and create themselves and create community in really creative ways. So I just want to just put a pin in that so that we can continue to map and support the places who are doing that really good work. I think about some congregations that have created 5-day-a-week programs where the kids can come and go and really feel like they're part of community, and they're building the institution themselves. And so we think about project-based learning, for example, when that happens in a congregation and the kids are actually taking ownership over hachrasat orchim, welcoming people, and creating new models for welcoming people into the community, baking and creating art that makes the institution look beautiful, and taking hold of holding the community and building the community through their learning, and in their presence in the building. They're already applying those problem-solving skills and the creative ways of thinking about, how do I get involved and build community as I get older? And I do think it is a challenge for our leadership to make sure to make them feel like they're really part of the process, as opposed to having to leave the institution in order to find a place for themselves. I love being part of a multi-generational community where my children feel connected to their grandparents and their great-grandparents who were founders of that institution. So there's a sense of heritage and connection that we might want to hold up and value and aspire to as well.
Yeah, I'll just build on that to say I'm not anti-institution. I am questioning the outsized role that institutions and professional Jews play in Jewish life. Not to say that they shouldn't exist, but to Daniel's reference of Yitz's third era, that power is centralized. And the impact of that is that it disempowers everybody else. And we're living in an age where everybody wants to be empowered. You can customize your own shoes, you can create whatever. We're in a world of platforms where everybody can play on top of that platform rather than just passive consumers. And so there's an updating of the entire ecosystem and economy, honestly, of Jewish organizations that needs to happen in order to be aligned with that, which is the lives that all of our people, or the vast majority of them, are playing. You know, I look at people who own yellow cab medallions who are stubbornly fighting Uber and Lyft. And okay, there's things about the gig economy that maybe should be fought, but you can't stick your head in the sand and deny that those platform-based things that are providing essentially the same function in society, you got to adapt, or otherwise you're going to die. And my big worry in the Jewish community is that we will so stubbornly stick our heads in the sand and point to other people who aren't joining synagogues and saying they're all bad Jews, that we will spend so much time and so many resources propping up those institutions that aren't adapting, as opposed to taking that time and energy and money and creativity and innovating into the future. So I think it's about getting our heads out of the sand and really facing the questions, Joshua, that you're asking today, and seizing hold of them and like running into the future, so that we can be successful and be adapting not only our skills as educators and the modalities of the moment, but also the organizational culture, the communal culture, the business models, all of that, so that we all succeed, as opposed to we all feel like we're hanging on by our fingernails.
Yeah. I appreciate that framing, Lisa. I think in that vein, I wonder if I can ask a couple lightning round questions, and then we'll go to some Q&A from the people watching at home. The first thing is, I think as we articulated earlier, the platform shapes the experience, and Zoom is really good for a replication of Judaism as program, right? It has a defined time and space. We can count who watched, and it replicates the experience of being together a little bit. I'm wondering if there are technologies that each one of you can answer. Are there technologies that you've encountered that you would like to just give a highlight or a shout out to, that you want other educators, other parents, other people in the sort of Jewish education industries to play with and take a look at? And I'll start with you, Lisa.
Goodness. I got asked a question the other day about what am I binge watching, and I have been so busy I haven't watched a single thing, and I was like, had no answer. I don't actually think that my answer is about the particular technologies. It's about how we get the technology out of the way, honestly, because the more you're obsessing about the technology, the less you're actually in real life. And I think one of the challenges of pivoting into this world is bringing our full selves, right? So when you walk into a room, you go through the parking lot, you go in the doors, somebody welcomes you, you smell what was being cooked in the kitchen the night before, you take off your coat, you say hi, you give somebody a hug, right? There's all these other pieces of the experience that make it rich and meaningful. And if you show up at 12:59 for a 1 o'clock class and you jump right in, it's the digital mezuzah Miriam was talking about before, you lose all this other context and richness, which is a lot of what we're trying to achieve, right? So the question is how you translate that. you know, you've seen both Daniel and I using our hands a lot, right? Because you don't have the full body language. So you have to use your hands, you have to think about your environment, you have to modulate your voice in a way that conveys as much as you possibly can so that it feels like a human experience, not like a two-dimensional experience. And I think we're getting a lot better at it over the last 2 months, but there's still a long way to go. So I would say finding the technologies and learning how to use them so that the technology itself is almost invisible, so you can really get to the other stuff of social norms and connections and content that matters most.
Okay, thank you for that lightning round non-answer, but I'll give it to you. Daniel, is there a technology that you think people should know about?
No. You probably know most of the technologies. You should know. I don't know, the one that I learned the most from, that I think a lot of people don't know about, is that you can download books for free from the library to listen to. Maybe you didn't know that, but like, I listen to an enormous amount of books that way. But no, I don't know. I kind of agree with Lisa on this. The technology is the least interesting part. It's a tool ultimately. It's not the education. It's a tool it's a means towards, you know, it's like talking about the hammer. It's like we're having a whole conversation about hammers and like the different things you can do with hammers. I'd rather talk about building buildings and, like, you know, understand the role that the hammer plays in building that building.
Miriam?
Another non-answer.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to join in the chorus of non-answer answers. I feel like my dad a little bit in this moment, and I don't mean this to be in a smart kind of way, but I think our best technology right now is our own capacity for creative thinking. Not just responding in panic mode or under duress, but saying, wow, what's the opportunity in this moment where suddenly the structures that dictated what we do, how we communicate, how we compartmentalize our time, how we manage ourselves, our work, and other people, a lot of that has been thrown to the wind. And so now we actually have to come up with new structures and new ways of thinking and new ways of relating to people, new ways of gathering, new ways of creating community. I don't have the technical skill, but I would really like someone to solve the music problem, because we can't gather and sing together this way. And I miss it. I think it's one of the things I miss the most about Jewish community. And that's not something that is going to be easily replaced, but hopefully we'll come up with other ways to find spiritual nourishment that we haven't been finding before. It's on us to come up with it and to prototype it and to share it. And frankly, I hope our kids come up with it. I hope our learners come up with it. I hope congregants come up with it and kind of bring it up from the Amcha, so to speak.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because it's also then what you're not saying, we need this new technology and we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's actually, how do we draw the things we love into this new era? And I appreciate that the question really became, at least what I heard Miriam and Lisa say was, these are the technologies I wish existed, right? There's something about the USB thing that you could, my colleague David C. Kalman talks about wanting to sit with a bunch of technologists and Jewish educators and technologists to think together, what do we need for Jewish life? So like something for the USB port that brings out some smells so that we can feel like we're in the same room. Or Miriam's observation, we need to be able to sing together. I think that's really important. I want to, one more.
Or if we had the USB to just plug in and have like the whole Gemara in our brain, then how would we use our time differently? I mean,
right.
If we're
Well,
really thinking
some
big.
of us would just go over it, and some of us would only look for the halachic outcomes, and that's the two people.
One other thing to this
Yeah.
conversation, which is a question of quality and production value, which I think is really hard for everybody to learn and do on their own. We shouldn't be expecting educators to be incredible creative technologists and also have amazing lighting and really reliable Wi-Fi connections and to be able to understand like what's the psychology and like the fidgetiness of every single student who's on their Zoom. It's unrealistic. So I think that there's also a question, and this maybe goes back to your first opening question about like what are the assumptions or the questions we need to be asking about. What are the roles and the kinds of expertise we need in this age. And that looks really different than a super well-meaning, knowledgeable person who wants to teach on Sunday mornings and Tuesday nights at the synagogue. And that's not to put that down. It's just to say, like, in a totally new model, the roles, the job descriptions, the expertise, and where you need to invest in quality might change. So for example, I'll just throw this out. What would it look like to have the master class equivalent of things that day schools or synagogue schools are teaching? High production volume, top-notch teachers that then thousands and thousands of people could use. And that the teachers that you already have, who are your own community and you already have relationships with, are kind of leading the sections in, you know, like college language. You go to the lecture, and then you have the breakouts that are more intimate with your own people, where you have those person-to-person relationships. It's an entirely different model, different job descriptions, different kinds of investments of money, but maybe would be more effective to have quality where quality makes a really big difference, and intimacy in small group relationships where that makes a difference.
Yeah, Miriam, my
Add to
life
that,
and rap skills have just been
I think the flip side of what Lisa is describing, or perhaps like a companion idea, is to really revolutionize how people think about teaching, and for people to see that each of us has a teacher in us. Each of us has something to teach, and each of us has the capacity to be a guide in certain ways. There are parents who can be TAs, to use, or section leaders, to use Lisa's model, for Hebrew school and supplementary school, to gather small groups, to take the material, to engage kids in conversation. There are grandparents, boomers, who I think, you know, who relish in telling the story of Passover, who could bring that storytelling and that heritage sharing to a kind of teaching. I think that we should be democratizing teaching as much as we're democratizing learning, and giving people the basic skills to become teachers in their own right, so that it's not just a matter of learning and teaching yourself, but being in that relationship with someone who has something to teach and give is such a gift. So I think that's something we should be exploring.
It's interesting to hear that, because what you're then doing is you're saying Jewish education, even though we want goals to be clear, Jewish education is really about a practice that Jews do. It's one of the practices that Jews do, which is Jewish education, and it comes out in lots of different ways. And sometimes it's about being with an expert, and sometimes it's about democratized knowledge, sitting around with a couple of people looking at Sefaria. I want to go to a couple of the questions that we've received from our participants at home. I guess we're all participants at home. Is one of the sort of threads of questions, because there were several questions about this that came out, is a concern about leaving older adults behind. I know my dad has been a techie for a while, but he's now tutoring his friends on how to do stuff. How do we make sure they remain part of the discussion, learning, conversation? Miriam, you started to teach on this. How can they be heritage sharers? But would love to hear other thoughts. What do we need to do to make sure that our community, all members of our community, have the skills and capacity to sort of share this Torah? Daniel, please.
Yeah. I mean, it's a super interesting question. I would say, though, optimistically, when the surveys that we did at My Jewish Learning, I remember like the percentage of people over 80 always made us like amazed. So I actually think that my bubby just passed away a few weeks ago. She was 103. She played bridge on her computer with people at 103. So, most of the technologies that we use are actually, accessible with the right technology. Obviously people need to have it. There could be something. I met someone who started a company once that was literally meant to replace like your kids. So like if you normally would call your kids for technology support, you would call this company instead. It was literally like call instead of your kid. So like maybe there's something like that, you know, to support, but I think, you know, most of these technologies are so, you know, intuitive and user-friendly that we use, that assuming people have them, I actually think it's more accessible for older people in many ways. The amount of programming that they could have in their home is so much more than, you know, outside. And so, you know, for my 103-year-old Bubby, it was hard for her to leave the house, right? So having connection to the internet is actually what connected her to the world. So, you know, we do have to make sure people can access it, but I'm optimistic that they will. Yeah.
I just want to add to that the power of an invitation. I did some research, this is several years ago now, for an organization that was thinking about doing Jewish book clubs. And I did research on book clubs just in general. Thousands of people responded. It basically broke down into thirds. A third of the people were in one or more book clubs and loved it. A third of the people were not in a book club and didn't want to. And a full third of the people wanted to be in a book club, but no one had ever invited them. And I think that that's true about adult learning in general in the Jewish community, that you think it's, you know, the sisterhood ladies who get together all the time and I don't know them, so maybe I shouldn't go. Or maybe it's only Hebrew speakers and I don't speak Hebrew, so I'm not going to go to the Torah study because I'm going to feel really, right? It's like whatever that stuff is in our head, the power of an invitation that's personal, not just a list of events that you could go to if you felt motivated, is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And I think that that applies in two places. One is about learning the technology. So my mom is in her 70s, pretty comfortable on Zoom, asked me a handful of questions. So she was like really comfortable on Zoom. And then she offered to all of her friends to teach them. And she held like 3 or 4, 1 hour, like just come, ask questions, be dumb, make mistakes, it's okay. And she did it right before Passover because she saw a bunch of her friends who usually host Seder opting out. She was like, do not let the fact that Zoom is intimidating you opt out from being part of a family Seder. So offering that and inviting her friends to come gave them a gift that then has enabled them to not only do Seder, but everything else over the past few months as well. So I think that's another great use of people who have skills and are willing to teach it and invite their friends and kind of pass that on. And then when you're sitting at home, having somebody reach out and say, do you want to come do this thing with me or be part of this thing? That person-to-person connection, well, whether it was or was not your norm before, it's all that much more important now, especially for older adults who are feeling all that much more isolated if they're in high-risk categories right now. So the personal invitation matters. And if we can make that a normative part of Jewish culture, we will have changed Jewish community for the long term. And I challenge everybody to be better at creating invitations.
Nice. I think both of your comments also point to one of the things educators and institutions need to think about is not just what they're going to teach, but how people are going to access and what we need to do to get people to access. And it leads to a second question, which we'll do just a short minute or two answer on, and then we'll get to a final question for all of you, which is, what do we do about young children and family education right now? How can technology be supportive, and what does that look like?
I have 2 twin 5-year-old boys, and I have no idea.
So,
yeah,
first of all, I think we need to give the parents support and permission to say, Dayenu, like, what I'm doing is enough, it's going to be enough. And at the same time, empower them to be able to take hold of some of this and do it authentically in their own words. There are resources, there's PJ Library, Bim Bum is still online, and some of that material's great for smaller kids. The Shaboom series was great. Books. I mean, reading, doing puzzles together, playing, lighting candles, sitting and having conversations, playing dress up together. I mean, just a lot of the stuff that's hard to do. Now, look, my youngest is 6.5, and this is really hard. I just want to acknowledge that working full time with a small child and trying to educate that child. And I also do not watch, I do also do not watch TV, and nor do I bake, by the way. So I want to just make sure that we have a balance of telling parents that what you're doing is good, maybe here and there giving them a happy hour so they can have a drink and tear their hair out with other parents and feel like that's part of their Jewish thing, and give them some tools and some boxes, you know, ship them some boxes at home with stuff they can make when that moment feels ripe, so that they can be creating together when they can.
Beautiful. So let me ask you my last question. I would love for you to leave us with your hopes, your dreams. What's an opportunity? What's a hope that you have for the broad range of Jewish education, the Jewish industry, Jewish education institutions, and those of us who are doing Jewish education outside of institutions? What's your big dream, you know, on one foot for each, for us to leave us with something sweet before Shavuot? And Lisa, we'll start with you, and then we'll do Daniel and Miriam.
You already started with me once. Man, this is a tough one. My hope is that actually we will let go of the heaviness and the scarcity mindset. I think we're in this radical time of change in society, not only with technology and generationally and globally. And I think it's stressing us out as a community, and there's a sense of like desperation. And what I would like to offer is permission to just let go of that heaviness and be a good enough Jew, a good enough parent, a good enough teacher, a good enough student yourself. By the way, continue to learn, take an online class, not as a teacher, but as a student, and see what it feels like. And to go into this seeing that in some sense we're given, I hate to use the word a gift, but this time really is an opportunity to recalibrate and be more expansive in our thinking. That I think when we come out of this, we will see some of the architectures of Jewish life change, and they're not going to be easy, but it's going to help us like take a leap into the future that ultimately is going to serve us really well. So don't be afraid of it. Try to embrace it.
Great, thank you. Daniel.
So I'll start with, you know, a caveat that relates to what I started with, which is just a little humility about where we are in this process, and that we don't know how things are going to, what things are going to look like when we get back. I can imagine a world in which, Lisa, I'm speaking with my hands now, and I'm like, you're making me self-conscious. I can imagine a world in which there's like another great awakening for American religion. And I can also imagine, because people just need connection and they need community and they need this. And I could also imagine a world in which people who were basically secular but thought of themselves as like, okay, well, they went to synagogue here and there, like this is just the, like, cuts it off basically. And there's a, you know, what we basically enter a, you know, a major secular age. So I like both of those seem equally plausible to me, actually. And the interventions we would need for those are different. So that's where I'll start. I would say, though, you know, where I do think there's enormous opportunity is in informal Jewish education. I don't see online education being better than, you know, my kids' progressive Jewish day school that we pay private school tuition for, right? Like, I don't see that happening, but I totally can imagine a world in which supplementary school education, there's a supplement, you know, a Jewish supplementary school online where students and families can design their own Jewish education. That is a much more appealing option than the local congregational school. So, you know, I think that's where the, you know, there's real opportunity. And I know that when the people I'm, you know, who are asking the questions now, like, you know, what is their opportunity for? I've always thought there was opportunity for that. It happens to be we're at a breaking point now, and so it's it might even be even more. But again, eyes wide open, that might come with with collateral damage to American Jewish institutions that exist and the way things function right now.
Yeah. And Miriam, finally, a sweet vision for the future, or not.
So I think we can be thinking macro and micro. When we look back at the history of the Jewish experience and how we've been shaped and reshaped as a people, we have these big watershed moments that required Jewish creativity for survival, whether it was the destruction of the temple or moving through various pivotal milestones of oppression that led to migration and reinvention of who we are and so on. But then there are also those small moments of creating new recipes and creating new music cultures and the food cultures and figuring out how to exist in a new host society. And that's the kind of creative thinking that happens in families by people who aren't famous. So some of this work, I think, has to be done as a collective, and I would like to see Jewish learning really engage learners in thinking about how to contribute not just to their own fulfillment, but to building a strong, collaborative, creative community. And our learning spaces should be the laboratories and the practice spaces for Jewish living. And that is going to come in lots of different forms. Where I think we're only beginning to reimagine what those structures can look like. And I think we should invest in the ones that are working because there is good cross-fertilization happening out there, and there is good innovation and reinvention that is happening out there.
Great. Thank you three for this conversation. It seems to me like it's just really helped me actually get into the spirit of Shavuot, which is about radical creativity and revelation, right? David Hartman saw the Sinaitic covenant as really the message of Jewish creativity and morality. And from this conversation, I'm taking away the need to rethink our structures while also thinking about what we've inherited. The need to think both in collective terms and smaller unit terms, and to think about, it's a bit of an ongoing revelation that's unfolding as we think together and create together, and that there are ways that that Jewish education is both going to be shaped by and has the potential to shape sort of the technologies that then lead to what's most important, which is a flourishing and robust Jewish life. So thank you very much for joining us. Chag Sameach, and this was wonderful. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so
Great
much.
conversation.
Be well.